Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Noel Casler podcast, episode 93. Hope you could hear that okay. I know there was a little audio problem last time, so I got a brand new Macintosh. Got the Mac Pro. It's got a better microphone. Even though I had a fancy microphone, I was having audio issues. So I'm trying this episode without a mic. Got some new lights there in the background for you guys watching on YouTube. I apologize. It's been a week or two since I've done this. And, there's been a lot going on. So I only want to come and do these, when I feel like I have something to say beyond just being angry and enervated, as so many of us are. It's just been a very long winter, very grueling January so far, I think. Well, January's over. It's February. So that's what I was waiting for. I was waiting to get the hell out of January. Couldn't leave fast enough. And I'm just coming off of watching that funeral today. I'm not even going to lie. I don't ever really have much prepared. I always have a lot to talk about, but I was sitting over there on my yoga mat crying, for the hour and a half, 2 hours that it went on. It just brought me to tears. I found it very moving. I found it very sad. I don't know what it's like to be, a young black man in America, but I know what it's like to love black people. I know what it's like to grow up alongside black people, kids, human beings, like I don't even understand how we're still stuck on all this stuff, how we see any difference in people. When they talked about how he just wanted to sit and watch cartoons and eat a big bowl of cereal, that was my childhood. The neighborhood I grew up in, that's what we all did. And to see how this country has kind of gone has completely gone in the other direction with race relations, it is so disheartening, because at least back then in the 70s, you felt like you were coming out of the dark times and it was going to get better. We'd come out of the 60s and the civil rights movement, and the 70s was certainly the fallout of it. But when I was a kid, I'm talking late 70s, early 80s. I was born in 71, as you guys know. We were still in that, sitting in our underoos, eating cereal, watching cartoons. And we all did that together, black, white, Latino, Middle Eastern. In my neighborhood, it took all time, all types. And it was the biggest blessing in my life, even though, it was seen at the time as sort of an underprivileged place to grow up. I had a single mom, as you guys know, and she was working her butt off, doing the best she could, as everybody else's parents were in that neighborhood, and we were just trying to get through life and enjoy life. And to see, the demonization that happened in the 80s when Ronald Reagan sort of came in and declared war on that community, and to see, Lee Atwater and the weaving into a narrative of fear the young black man. That's a lot of what I saw by the late 80s, and a lot of media played along. There was a lot of articles about wolf packs in New York, and fighting back against these urban toughs and, kids with guns and all these terrifying things. And that's not to say there weren't, horrific problems in the inner city, as there are to this day. That's not to say Memphis doesn't have its share of crime, but the war on crime was essentially a war on young black men and black families. And it's heartbreaking that we're still dealing with that we're not kind of living together and trying to all get along and do the best we can and love each other and lift each other up. And we should want everybody, to enjoy life and have all the opportunities. I'm sitting there watching the funeral, and I got a delivery of FedEx, right? And this young black man brings the FedEx. to my house down my driveway, probably 30 years old. He could have been the age, of Tyree Nichols, and I was just like, I appreciate you, man. I was like crying before he got here, and I didn't want him to, see me all crying when I came to the door. And of course, I wasn't going to mention like what I was watching. He's at work. I'm not going to, sort of single him out and message it, but I tried to, I tried to project love as best I could. And it's a hard situation, and I can't imagine what that family's going through, and listening to his mom, it just breaks your heart. And to learn about this young man, that he was a guy who wanted to go photograph sunsets every night, and he did. You guys have heard me talk about the fact that, like, if there was a religion that I was going to ascribe to in life, it would be like sunset's a religion. I think everybody should head out, when the sun goes down, and watch it collectively, as a people, and then make sure everybody's fine as night falls. You got enough to eat, your kids have a safe place to sleep, another day, another blessing, and then the stars come out and the moon comes out, and, everyone's safe in their homes, and, sharing music and laughter and stories. And, that sounds Pollyannish, right? It sounds some like utopian kind of dream, but I would think that indigenous peoples have sort of lived that way, for tens of thousands of years, right? And this culture, this American experiment, we're 300 something years old, and we're based on capitalism, and we're based on exploitation that, we have moved past as a country to a large extent, right? We don't enslave people and make them do their, the work for us anymore for no pay. Now it's low pay, right? But we've moved past that. But we have a political movement in this country that wants to go back in the other direction, that doesn't want to teach history. Today's the first day of Black History Month. It's February 1st. The first headline I saw this morning in the New York Times was about how the College Board had adopted, and folded under Ron DeSantis's pressure to not have these advanced placement, studies, these African American studies that he's waged war on in Florida, that they've adopted that, that they're not going to have those questions on the College Board tests. That's insane. Like, what? How is this happening? How is it getting away with this? And how is it becoming so popular? And it clearly is. We see it in Congress. We see it in governorships all across the country. We certainly saw it in Donald Trump and MAGA. We see a reemergence of not only, fascism, and not only overt racism, but a denying of who we really are, and a rewriting of history, and a false sense of you can do no wrong if you were born a young white man, and the Black Americans are not worthy of study. And it's like not having enough faith in a people to tell them the truth. The truth won't hurt you. The truth will set you free. It might be painful and uncomfortable, but those kids in those classrooms learning those lessons are not the same people that were perpetrating these crimes. We're just trying to give an honest narrative and an honest accounting of America and how we've gotten to this moment, and how many of our systems have been, stacked against African Americans in this country for far too long at an institutional level. And I don't need to get all back into that because I pretty much talk about it every week. But it's a shame, and it's not doing anybody any favors, okay? It's not doing the children of Florida any favors. Black, white, Asian, Latino, they're going to grow up less than. They're going to grow up with meager educations that were spoon-fed them by racist white men looking to enrich themselves and further their grasp on power. Ron DeSantis went to Yale and got a history degree, okay? He knows the difference. He knows what he's saying is complete lies and it's complete BS, but he knows it's going to play well with an ignorant, emerging suburban white kind of population in this country that Trump exploited and branded in a way where people feel completely fine, flying a F Brandon or whatever these stupid sayings are flag on their front yard, or a Blue Lives Matter flag, which is different than supporting police, right? The Blue Lives Matter was like, screw you, we'll kill whoever we want. Cops can do no wrong. And I grew up very close, in my high school years with the kind of people whose dads were cops and firemen. And I know cops that I love, man. I know people that are NYPD that have been, on the job forever that I love, like I consider family and have very close relationships. That's not to say there isn't endemic racism and brutality in policing. There is. It's out of control. And anybody who doesn't admit that is blind to it, or willfully going along with it because it won't affect them, right? It won't creep into their suburb, and it'll make them feel safer when they go down to the city. And the fear is an illusion anyway that's being pumped into their homes every night on Fox News and Newsmax, and by politicians like, Lee Zeldin, backed by, I think it was Ron Lauder, who dumped all this money into his campaign, and they put all this crime narrative, and they flipped New York. They picked up 4 congressional seats. The Republicans did. That's insane. It's insane that happened in 2023, but it did, right? And even Kathy Hochul is now becoming sort of reactionary to the success of the GOP, and saying that she wants to fund these sort of squads, these specialized tactical units that are going to stop crime before it happens, which is ridiculous, right? That's just a misnomer. You can't do that without impinging and infringing on someone's civil rights. I saw it when Giuliani was president. He wished he was president. When Giuliani was mayor, they did that. You'd go in the city and you'd be in the subway, and you'd see people getting thrown up against subway walls all the time. Cops just kind of, what are you doing? Amadou Diallo, all those cops jumped out of that unmarked car and said freeze to this young African immigrant, right, who was here to better his life and study. And he was scared, and he reached for his wallet, and they shot him 41 times as he was entering his home without asking him any questions. That's murder. That's murder. And Giuliani defended them instantly, right? And people in the white suburbs defended those cops. Not everybody when the truth came out, but you weren't really meant to hear the truth. And when that was all going down, I worked for Springsteen on the reunion tour. I've told this story before probably, but I was hired to work on a bunch of shows we did at the Garden at the end of the tour. They filmed it. Jonathan Demme made a movie about it. It's live in New York City, if you've ever heard that great E Street Band album. Yeah, it was the first time they'd been back together since the 80s. And it was an incredible tour, and it was an incredible bunch of shows. But it was right when that stuff was sort of roiling New York City, when that particular case, and Abner Louima before that. It was an epidemic, and it sort of reached this tragic watershed moment. And Bruce wrote about it, as he does. He's a wonderful chronicler of this country, and certainly of the tri-state area, especially. And he wrote this song, and he debuted it in Atlanta. And I wasn't on the tour in Atlanta. I was just to work in New York. So he played it in Atlanta. They had a day off, and they were coming to New York City. And the New York PBA got wind of the fact that he'd played this song in Atlanta. And the cover of the New York Post was like, the boss says F you to the cops, and it wasn't, I don't think it was Pat Lynch at the time, who's the PBA head now, but it was somebody like that. And he basically told all his officers, protest Bruce, screw Bruce. So we had to lock down backstage security, right? Because there was so many death threats and stuff coming in. It was insane. And cops were, getting drunk. I remember a dude rushed the stage, a cop, and to put his badge up, and was giving Bruce the finger. It was insane. They were acting like a gang that was beyond reproach. And they held on to that grudge for years. Okay. But I shouldn't even tell you some of the stuff they tried to do to him to pay him back, but they did it. I've seen it. Thuggish kind of stuff, and endangering crowds, to make a political point and not give him support that he'd paid for. But anyway, because you pay for private security, you pay for police security when you do big events. But anyway, so I brought Amadou Diallo's parents backstage because he was playing this song every night. Bruce ain't going to back down. You're not going to tell Springsteen what to do, and you're not going to bully him. So he played the song because it was an important song. And the song, if you actually listen to the lyrics, wasn't attacking the police. The song was from both sides. He was talking about a cop, who's got a young wife at home, who's heading into the city and doing this job and sort of pumped full of fear and making a split-second decision because they're sent out there as if they're going into battle, which is your first problem. Right? Because you remember back in the day, cops would carry bully clubs or whatever you call them. They would be a little more hand to hand. You had patrol guys walking beats. They knew people in the neighborhood. It was my people, like a lot of Irish cops in New York, Italians and stuff. But, they'd sort of be of the neighborhood. They weren't patrolling. They weren't coming from this sort of insular suburbs as if they were going into battle, which is what happened after the 60s and after the sort of white flight that went to the suburbs. And now a lot of the cops in the suburbs, they live in Orange County or they live in Long Island. And again, I know a lot of these guys. I'm friends with them. All the guys who work at NBC, the security team there, they're all on the job. They're at NBC all day, but these are great guys. I mean, these guys are in my phone. I go to church with them. Like, I'm not attacking police. We need police, but we need reform. We need sensitivity, not just training. We need to look at what's going on, at what we're telling our police to do to our citizenry, right? Because the cops work for us. Don't tell them that. Don't say you pay their salary when they pull you over, but we want them to keep our communities safe. Everybody does. Every American wants to live in a safe place. They want their children to play on safe streets. And a man who gets murdered on the way home, who's calling out for his mom by guys that are supposed to be protecting him. And in this case, by guys that were black guys too, right? But they were blue in that moment. They were operating as a gang. And I guess there was a white guy involved too. They didn't really hype that side of it up too much, right? They fired those 5 black guys real quick. You didn't hear about the white guy until like the tapes came out, and I'm not laughing. There's nothing funny about it. I'm just saying that's convenient in Memphis, right? So, it's staggering, the loss and the pain. When those tapes came out Friday, I mean, we all dreaded it all day. They were sort of hyping it up too much, because it's like snuff porn. I don't want to see anybody get murdered. I, especially as any of us are, am just beyond tired of seeing this. You have trauma from watching it. You can't imagine what it's like in the black community. I kind of can, right? Because I do love black people and it looks like my friends, So you seeing your friends get murdered. We're not any different. We all bleed red, right? And to have any reaction other than how do we stop this and make sure it doesn't happen again is the wrong reaction. We can't keep slipping into this tribalism. Well, you're trying to defund the police, which was the dumbest slogan ever. I hope we can all agree on that. Okay, that didn't do anybody any favors. I understand what they meant by it, but it was a dumb slogan. Okay, but we have to have serious reforms in this country, And the Blue Lives Matter guys kind of disappeared on this case, right? All the other dudes, Derek Chauvin, they were supporting, right? All these other guys, like they were, all these other cops who'd murdered somebody, they were behind, but not this time, since it was black guys who did it. They're like, yeah, you're right. These guys are monsters. They'll lock them up. So, I don't know what the answers are. I'm just so tired of it. I wrote a song, when all the stuff, when Michael Brown was murdered by the police, in St. Louis. I was on tour with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and we were watching the stuff go down on TV every night. You know, there was all this unrest and everything, and we were in the Midwest. And I remember sitting in catering with Graham one night, whose birthday is in a couple days. Happy birthday, Graham! But we were sitting in catering one night, and I was like, I can't even watch this anymore. Like, I got to go write a song or something about it. And Graham goes, "You're right, Noel. You know, I'm gonna do that too. I'm gonna go to my room and, you know, after the show and write a song." So we sort of, it wasn't like a contest, but we were both kind of like seeing what we could come up with. And he wrote a song and he got to play it. It's called like "Whistle Down the Wind" or something like that. And then I wrote a song, and I quite liked it, and I gave it to a friend of the band. I'm sure I've told this story to you guys before, who's married to Arlo Guthrie's daughter, Sarah Guthrie, and this guy's named Johnny Irion. He's a good singer. He happens to be the great nephew of John Steinbeck, which was cool, right? So his wife is like Woody Guthrie's granddaughter, and he's like the great nephew of John Steinbeck, right? So it's like Depression era royalty, right? Dust Bowl royalty. So I gave them the song. They made a great demo out of it, sang it, and it was really nice. And we decided to put it out. My stipulation was it had to be like a benefit single because it was about something that was happening. I wasn't doing it to make any money. So we put it out, and all the proceeds went to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And Morris Dees was the head of the SPLC at the time, and he wrote me a really nice email about like how his words reminded him, you know, of some of the great, you know, civil rights kind of he said it reminded him of something Dr. King had said, and I'm not in any way equating, you know, what I wrote anything near that, but he said it reminded him of the famous quote about, you know, the arc of the moral, you know, universe is slow but swift, but it bends towards justice or whatever. I'm mangling the quote because I'm embarrassed to even say that, but he said it in this email he sent to me, and it meant a lot, you know, and hopefully it raised a little bit of money. And I wish I had the ability to play the song for you. I'm on a new laptop, but anyway, so I wrote this song, and I ran into Crosby the next day, and I sent David the demo. You know, we were in our day off in a hotel, so I emailed him the song. I was like, "Johnny just heard this song," and he came up to me the next day at the gig, you know, before the gig, we're walking through the parking lot or something, and he's like, "Hey, Noel, I heard your song. You know, you should be very happy with what Johnny did with it. I think it's great." You know, he goes, "Don't tell Graham this, but I think your song's better." You know, and that's not, I'm not saying I'm a better songwriter. He was just like, "I'll deny it if you tell him I said that, but it's better. And I'll tell you why, because his song sounded a little preachy, like he was talking about the external circumstances." And he goes, "Your song, you did what I like to do and what I teach people about songwriting. If you're writing about the Eiffel Tower, you don't sit there and you don't say, 'I'm looking up at the Eiffel Tower. It's made out of steel. There's lights on top. You know, I can see Paris around it.' You don't do it that way. You say, 'Hey, I'm climbing up the stairs to go up to the top of the Eiffel Tower, and I don't think I'm going to make it.' You know, and then you got the people." And when he told me that, it was such a moment that he was sharing this insight. And I knew exactly what he meant, because that's what I like in art. Something that puts me there, that makes me feel empathy, right? Because it's empathy, as I talk about every week. That's how we really change. And that's what we react to in others. You know, that's what stories are for, to help you understand your fellow man and make sense of your own life, right? Because we're in many ways, we're all the same, right? We're not, but we are. And anything that brings us closer and brings us, you know, further towards understanding that helps a lot. So that was a compliment that Cross gave me. And I know he passed away since I have done an episode, and I wrote about it on Substack. I kind of like what I said there. So I don't think I'm going to get too much into any kind of eulogy for him. You guys have been hearing a lot of that stuff, but He was a hell of a guy, man. I mean, he was a force of nature, and he was a complicated guy. I tell people who are like, I'm friends with Crosby. I'm like, is he pissed off at you yet? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, you don't really know Crosby yet. Okay. To really know that man, you go through a period of like, he stops speaking to you or you stop speaking to him or whatever. That's just how he was. He was one of those guys who needed to be pissed off at somebody or somebody or something, right? It was a big part of his art. He needed to kind of be angry, at the cops or getting the flu or old age or whatever. And that's what kept him Crosby. He was this irascible guy, but he had a huge heart, and he had a huge heart for artists. He did so many things that people will never hear about, to help other people out. I remember we were sitting somewhere and I bought a Collings, which is a really nice guitar. And we were in Nashville, and I bought a Collings at Gruhn's, George Gruhn's, a famous, guitar dealer in Nashville. And I saw him the next day in the lobby, and I was like, I got a Collings last night. Very nice guitar. I sold it. I don't have it anymore. But I got a Collings, Cros, and he's like, let me check it out. It's very nice. He goes, I have a Collings, or I had a Collings. He goes, they let me come to the factory, and they let me walk around and like pick out the wood and everything I wanted. And they built it for me, because he's David Crosby. And I go, oh, where is it? He goes, I gave it away. I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, there was a kid in Santa Barbara. He was really good. I saw him in coffee houses and stuff, but he had a crappy guitar. So I gave him the Collings. That's David Crosby, man. That's a $5,000 guitar 20 years ago. Not everybody would do that. And he wasn't doing it. I'm probably the only person he told that besides Jan, his wife, like he wasn't doing it for show. It was just who he was. If you were an artist, he wanted to encourage you, and you didn't have to be famous or cool. He was particular about what he liked. If he didn't vibe with you, you probably weren't getting a second chance, but not, that's who he was. But if he liked what you were doing, he was down with it, man. He was going to help you. And he was always sort of, picking people up, like other artists would just come into the fold, and he'd be like, who's that? He'd be like, oh, this great singer, I met her, where, such and such, and invited her to sound check and stuff. And he would do these solo tours, and he'd pick people he loved to be in his backing band. James Raymond, his son, was in the backing band, who was also in Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And, Django was his road manager. That's his youngest son with Jan. And I kind of helped train Django. I'd known Django since he was like a kid, and he became a road manager the last couple of years. Traveled Europe with us and Japan, and I know they're all hurting, but well, I remember one time we did a gig with the Dalai Lama up in Syracuse, and I was really excited. I'm gonna get to meet the Dalai Lama. I'm like, yoga guy. Martin Luther King III was there. Speaking of that, he was there. It was this big event at the Carrier Dome, and an incredible event. And I was all excited. I was sitting in the lobby. I was gonna meet the Dalai Lama, and Crosby had sort of been mad about some mix-up that happened the night before with his hotel room. He didn't like his hotel room and all that. They gave him like a Murphy bed. It wasn't appropriate for his age, but it was out of my control. But he was pissed. So I saw him the next morning, and he's coming through the lobby, and I'm in this line, like a receiving line, with all these monks that travel with the Dalai Lama. And first of all, the Dalai Lama was staying in our hotel. So how cool is that? I think I've talked about this before. I'm doing handstands and like feeling like I'm getting the power coming up through the floors, and I'm standing there, and I'm like third in line to greet His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And as soon as he gets kind of near me, Crosby taps me on the shoulder and like pulls me out of the line and curses me out for I thought you were a professional. No, you weren't last night, blah, blah, blah. But he'd give you shit and then he'd forget about it 5 minutes later. But, that was Crosby. And he was friends with the Dalai Lama, I'm trying to remember the guy who produced it. I worked with a lot too, who produced this event. And he's the guy who did all the Billy Joel albums and engineered him. He was a real legend. Phil Ramone, the great producer, Phil Ramone, who I got to work with a ton of times too. I did the Latin Grammys and stuff. So I was like there working for Crosby, but I had all these connections on the TV side too, including Phil and his, second in command, this wonderful woman who runs a lot of production. They run the Songwriters Hall of Fame and all this stuff in New York. So they knew me, and I was there with Cros. So it was one of those interesting, like, I was serving two masters kind of deal. And, there was some drama that went down. It wasn't an easy gig. It never was, but it went off, we got it to happen. And I remember sitting with Jan, and we watched the Dalai Lama's speech, because he gave this talk after all these musical performances. And he gave this little laugh at the end of his talk. And the Carrier Dome is like 90,000 people on it. It's a big basketball arena or something huge, up in Syracuse. And he gives this laugh. And I remember watching it ripple through the crowd and then come back to him like energy. It just went all the way through the crowd and came all the way back. And I turned to Jan and I was like, man, like he just gave his love to the whole audience, and you saw it come back like energy, like you could see it. And she was like, I can't believe you noticed that. Yeah, that's exactly what happened, And so that was kind of the beginning of my time with them. And I remember backstage that night, there was all these people. Whoopi Goldberg was there, who I've worked with a lot. I used to be her escort when she would host the Tonys, and she was very close with Crosby and Jan. They were good friends. And she has a right-hand man. I won't say his name, but he's like her longtime assistant. Very cool guy. And I'm back in the green room with Crosby, and like Crosby goes over to see Whoopi, and I'm like his road manager. And then Whoopi's like, hey, Noel, how you doing? And Randy, her guy's like, hey, Noel, what's up, buddy? He gives me a big hug. And Crosby's like, what the hell? Like, I thought you're here with me. How do you know Whoopi? And we got in the, and then there was Cyndi Lauper was there, all these other people I worked with. Cyndi Lauper, by the way, got nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame today. So long overdue, and she should be in first ballot, no question. But anyway, I digress. But I remember we got in the car at the end of the night. It was me, Cros, and Jan. And Crosby goes, he leans forward. I'm in the front seat. And he goes, no, is there anybody in the entertainment business you don't know? And I'm not saying that like I'm Mr. Cool and know people. I'm saying it like Crosby appreciated that, right? Crosby wanted the guy who was going to get things done, right? The guy who knew who knew everybody in a venue. Like, they want the fixer. That's what Jan kept saying to me. And my first gig ever, I'd already been working for Jackson Browne, and they had the same management at this time. This is years ago. And it was the Songwriters Hall of Fame, actually, with Phil Ramone, and CSN was being inducted. And James Taylor came to sing with them. And we're actually sitting in a green room, and they practiced Helplessly Hoping, which is a Stephen Stills song, but it has all their harmonies. And I'm sitting there with a friend of mine who didn't know CSN's music at all. And it's like a little green room. This is at the Marriott Marquis in Times Square. And they practice the harmony. They just run through the chorus of Helplessly Hoping. And my friend, who's kind of more from the gospel, like hip hop world, she looks at me and she goes, Noel, I don't know who these motherfuckers are right now, but that's from God. That singing is from God right there, And that's what that music did. Music, if it hits the right frequencies and reverberates in the right way, it's universal. It'll make anybody feel good. And Crosby, for all of who he was as a person, had this angelic quality to his voice that was undeniable when it meshed, most specifically with Graham Nash, and then you add on Stephen Stills and, James Taylor, in this instance, Neil Young, many times together. But it was Crosby and Nash. I mean, those guys locked in. And Nash was a master of harmony, and Nash would go up and under Crosby. Nash could just weave himself around Crosby's voice in this miraculous way, where the whole was so much bigger than the parts, and we had this game. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but the sound guys, the monitor mixers on the side of the stage would often isolate like Crosby's vocal, in the middle of one of these wonderful harmonies, and you'd hear Crosby's vocal alone and it would sound like a wail or something, it would sound off key, because he had a very interesting tonality and a very forceful tone, and you heard it alone, it would be like, whoa! It was like this weird sound. And we would just laugh like, what the hell is that? And then you bring in Graham and boom, that's magic. The sum was bigger, than the parts, and or the whole, whatever the thing is. But that was amazing. So anyway, we're doing this gig, and I told you the green room story, and my friend's like, that's from God. And at the end of the night, there's like a way to get out of Marriott Marquis. You got to go through the kitchen and you go down to the loading dock, and I can have SUVs pull up in the loading dock, and you get out of there and you avoid this notorious scrum of autograph seekers, and people have been like, surrounded. And these are the professional autograph seekers. These aren't fans. These are people that get paid. They give them a bunch of pick guards and say, go get the rock stars to sign these and give them back to me. I'll give you $40. So you're just like getting hunted by these professional autograph guys if you leave that venue the traditional way. And it happened to Jackson a few years earlier. I was with Jackson, and they didn't want it. They'd heard about that. So they're like, hey, this guy Noel knows a special way out. And it wasn't that special. Like anybody on production could have figured it out, but I happened to be the guy assigned to do it. And I took them out that way, and they just loved it. And the very next gig we did, later that year was the 25th anniversary of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And there were these big concerts at Madison Square Garden. And once again, I was hired to work with CSN. So we were in the SIR and, in the rehearsal studios for a couple of days, which is I could do a podcast on that alone. Bonnie Raitt rehearsing, Paul Simon. Bonnie Raitt sang with CSN. She sang Love Has No Pride in the rehearsal room. And both Paul Simon, his band, and Springsteen's band all came into our control room to hear her sing this song. Is how incredible it was. If you've never heard her version of that, she did it. There's a tribute album to Nicolette Larson where she sings Love Has No Pride, the Libby Titus song, and who's married to Don Fagan, who I also know, who are my neighbors in the city. But like, I'm digressing. I'm not trying to make this name drop thing. I'm trying to get to a point. So we're doing this rainy Rock and Roll Hall of Fame rehearsal thing, and there's clearly magic, right? Jeff Beck, who just passed away, is on the gig with Stevie Wonder. I mean, it's just everybody. And sort of, they did it like different eras of rock and roll, right? So CSN represented like Laurel Canyon, right? So we had Jackson Browne and Bonnie, and I don't think Carole King was there that time, but they're all like a family. So they were representing that sort of era. And when we got to the gig, I had to go over there early. So we get to the Garden, and we had to make special arrangements to have the SUV drive all the way up backstage at MSG, right? To go all the way to the backstage thing it's the 5th floor. If you don't know New York City, like the first floor of the Garden, like where you watch them play basketball, is actually 5 stories up off the street, right? So there's this, circular kind of driveway thing that you can go up there in the loading dock, and very few people get like permission to do that. Right. You got to be at a certain level, like Springsteen kind of stuff. They don't let anybody just drive up there. We made arrangements for Crosby to get to do that because he was, even then, he had health challenges, and you wanted to make it as easy as possible on him. So they had stopped him at the bottom, right? The SUV he was in was stopped. The security guy down there didn't get the memo, which always happens, and they call up over the walkie to see if it's okay. And somebody goes, yeah, Noel okayed it. Not that I'm a boss at the Garden or anything, but Noel okayed it. And Crosby hears my name. He just hears that my name is said, and next thing they know, they're getting waved through, right? So they drive up there, they get out of the limo. This is a massive event. There were several different production teams involved, one of which was sort of in competition with another. You don't need all the backstage drama, but there's all the kind of politics that happens in production. So all these guys run up and try to like commandeer CSN and pull them aside and bring them to the dressing rooms. And I'm kind of standing back, and Crosby sees all these people. He sees me in the distance and he points. He goes, listen, the only fucking guy I'm listening to is that dude right there. I'm only going where he tells me where he's going, where I'm going. That's Crosby in front of all these guys, these bigger than me rock guys. And they all just had to back off, Those are the moments I'll remember with Crosby. Yeah. Oh, what a loss, what a talent, and I'm so lucky to have all those memories. I don't want to keep going on about it, but we had some adventures. We took the Queen Mary over to England. I talked about that, I think, on the last podcast before I knew he'd passed away. He hadn't yet passed away, but we took the Queen Mary from Brooklyn to England. Crosby loved to sail. He loved to be on boats. But like we hit the biggest storm they'd had in the North Atlantic in like 17 years or something. And there was 50-foot waves up by Nova Scotia, by like the Flemish Cap. That boat was getting thrown around like a rubber ducky. It was terrifying. And I was like, get me off of this. Like we're sitting in the dining car eating, and like a wave would come and the whole boat would list. And you'd see like the wave crash over the windows, and you'd see like octopus and bubbles and stuff. Like you'd be like, oh my God, like the ocean is taller than the boat, like crazy stuff. And Crosby was loving it, man. He wasn't scared at all, and it's things like that. You tour with people, it becomes like a little family. I told this story on Twitter, but I remember one night we were cross-loading in Italy, which means like, you have to get off the bus and you're switching gear and stuff. And I think we were in Verona, right? Where's the Romeo and Juliet, like that town. And it's old medieval town, little road. So you're not driving in there with a tour bus. So we have to get off in like the middle of the night, get off the tour buses, and these Italian promoter guys pick us up in these little cars and drive us through this village. And they're just flying. They're going like, 60, 70 miles an hour on these tiny little streets. And it's me, Crosby, and Django in the back of this thing. And it's just like crazy. And all these low slung buildings. And we feel like we're being kidnapped or ambushed or something, And I turned to Cross and I was like, dude, we're in Black Hawk Down. Because it just reminded me of that movie had just come out or something. He thought that was the funniest thing. He was like, oh my God, it is. And he's got this, barrel-chested laugh, this just laugh that fills the room. It's so loud, and it was a stupid joke, but he just thought it was the funniest thing in the world, He just, as a dude who knew how to enjoy life, and he helped those around him. And he was a sweet guy too, If you got sick on the road, Crosby was the guy bringing you chicken soup. He was the guy helping you out if you were in the crew. And I won't keep going into it, but rest easy, Cros. You earned it. You earned it, brother. Man, it's heavy. I guess I should get back to talking about politics and stuff. I don't even know what to say about it all. I know everybody's tired. You can feel it. You can feel everybody getting burnt out and tired. And that's part of the design. That's what they're hoping to do. They're trying to wear us out. They're trying to just throw as much stuff as possible and make it hard to speak out, make it hard to be on Twitter. Elon Musk has pretty much destroyed Twitter. Like we're still on there, but it's not the same experience. Thankfully, there's a lot of the people I love are still on there, but it's not what we had even a year or two ago. Right. And that's a danger. That's a legitimate threat, because you need that ability to to give information, right? How did George Floyd protest? Like, how did we really know what was going down with that stuff, right? It was Twitter. You'd see it on Twitter before you'd see it on TV. You can share information about outrages really quickly on there, and they're making that a lot harder, and that's by design. And Congress is now just trolls, right? Kevin McCarthy told Jamie Raskin, right? Representative Raskin, who lost his son, right? But to suicide like a week before January 6th, and then had to be the hero and show up on January 6th. And then he had to do the investigation, to work on the committee that investigated what went down. And now he's got cancer that he's battling. He's lost his hair. So he's wearing a bandana on the floor of Congress, to make himself feel more comfortable, which is his right as a patient. And Kevin McCarthy, citing some arcane rule of Congress, says he has to remove, his headdress, which is what they tried to do to Ilhan Omar too, Representative Omar. It's just bullying of the lowest common denominator. They didn't tell Trump to take the dead ferret off his head, right? When he gave the State of the Union, that ain't real hair either. It actually is real hair, but that kind of dehumanizing stuff, the MTG saying COVID is over, the lack of empathy for the pandemic, that took over 1.5 million Americans so far and isn't over, right? We're not in a global pandemic where things are shut down. You can safely go out, being cautious. You should still be cautious and wear masks when you can and be smart about it. But we're getting back to business, but to pretend like you don't need any restrictions or any vaccine or just going to be stupid about it is a dishonor to those we lost in this country and the amount of suffering that people went through and the amount of people that I still know that are immunocompromised that can't leave their homes. What does it say to these people that have been home for 3 years now to have MTG and a congressman say, I'm introducing an act to say COVID is over? It's insane. It's bullying. It's meant to either make you so angry that you become ineffective, which is what I fear happens to me. The reason I haven't done a pod in a while is I don't want to get on here and just rant, angrily at you for an hour. That's not going to help anybody. I don't want to BS you. Things are bad. I want to kind of break this stuff down, but to process it and not get overwhelmed is a real challenge. And we have to take care of ourselves to do this, right? We have to sort of, put some kind of force field around ourselves and block out the negativity. And I don't really have, that doesn't mean block out the news. It means block out the sort of character defects that come up. I always equate things to recovery, because that's what I have to do. There's a saying in recovery that, justified anger is the dubious luxury of normal men, right? You can't even afford to get angry. And to me, that's kind of impossible. I can't help but get angry when I hear, like I did last week, not even last week, it was the other day, right? That Bill Barr did all this crazy stuff, right? With the other dude who was investigating the investigators, right? What's his name? Who's doing the report in opposition to the Mueller report, right? I can't think of his name right now. This is why I need you guys. I need some real-time stuff. You know who I'm talking about. The guy whose report hasn't even come out yet. But that guy, how they were traveling around to Italy and trying to get dirt on Hillary Rodham Clinton. This is in 2019, ahead of the election. Bill Barr is traveling on the public, funds, on the DOJ's dime, which means taxpayers' dime, to Italy and England, trying to get at the origins of the Russia investigation, and the Brits and the Italians were like, what do you mean the origins? It was real. We got it from our intelligence agencies and we weren't involved in that. But by the way, says the Italians, we do have information that Trump was involved in some international financial crimes, you know? And they were like, oh shit, you know, well, we better take this information, right? So Barr and it's driving me nuts. I can't think of the guy's name. But so Barr and that guy, right, take the information and then decide to keep it amongst themselves, not to assign it to anybody else at justice. And they came to the miraculous conclusion that no further investigation was warranted, right? That to me is maddening, especially when you know it happened right before Jeffrey Epstein died in the summer of 2019, which very much benefited Donald Trump and very much benefited Bill Barr, right, whose father worked with Jeffrey Epstein, who hired Epstein to teach at Dalton, even though Epstein was just a student at Cooper Union. He did not have a degree, and all of a sudden he's teaching physics, you know, and in reality, he was his wingman. I know somebody who taught at Dalton at the same era. You know, these guys were creeps, you know. Bill Barr's dad, Donald Barr, was a creep. He wrote science fiction novels about teenage sex slaves. He taught up at Hackley School. They nicknamed, he didn't teach, he was the headmaster. They called him Chester the Molester, okay? Bad dude. Bill Barr, bad dude. Opus Dei, you know? These guys are trying to take over the sort of democracy in the name of this sort of Catholic, extreme Catholic, fascist, you know, kind of ideology. This super hardcore militant stuff. Barr gleefully talked about the, you know, 13 prisoners that the federal government executed, more than we'd had in like 50 years in Trump's final 6 weeks. He just went on a killing spree. You know, there's a great article about it in Rolling Stone. It was either the last 6 months, but in January, when he already knew he was like leaving office, they started like, you know, doing it even faster and not giving any pardons. At the same time, Trump is pardoning Roger Stone. He's pardoning Paul Manafort, right? Who was working for Oleg Deripaska, right? Who was hired an FBI agent who was also investigating Trump's ties, you know, to the Russians in 2016. That guy was on the take. Right? This is mind-blowing stuff. It's so hard to keep track of it all and not get pissed off and say, F it. You know, I'm trying to break it out. But just for Barr, he had a lot of, you know, reasons to corrupt this stuff. And Kavanaugh is an Opus Dei. My ex-neighbor, Larry Kudlow, who was Jewish and then became Catholic, explain that, you know, and I'm not dissing Catholics. I was raised by a Jesuit, you know, when I lived with my grandparents in high school, my grandfather was an you know, Jesuit priest, step-grandfather, and my grandmother, you couldn't get a more devout Catholic. Like, I'm from Irish Catholic stock, and I know a lot of wonderful Catholics, but there's a lot of corruption there, like there is, you know, in any kind of institution that becomes so rich, they start making their own laws. And there's some kind of weird thing with Bill Barr and all this stuff. You know, and a weird thing about Bill Barr, he went to the Corpus Christi Elementary School on the Upper West Side that George Carlin went to as well. Like, isn't that weird? And then he went to Horace Mann, and I know people who knew him at Horace Mann, where a lot of my friends went. And you know, he was a bully then in the late 60s. He was a bully at Columbia. He used to help the cops beat up the Vietnam protesters. So he's always been an asshole, for lack of a better term. He sort of came to fame, to real fame. He worked at the CIA in the 70s and stuff, but his big gig was the 80s in Iran-Contra and getting Elliot Abrams and all these guys off who had massacred villages, right? They were funding death squads that were going into villages in El Salvador, El Mozote in particular, and just slaughtering women and children, you know, in the name of fighting communism. But really horrible stuff, illegally funded in the Iran-Contra affair and the selling of weapons to Iran to fund these rebels, and cocaine, obviously, which was flown up from Jim Hole's farm in Costa Rica and dumped in the inner cities and turning the inner cities into a war zone. Those same neighborhoods that I lived in as a kid with my Black friends sitting in our, you know, underoos watching Saturday morning cartoons, right? In the late 70s and early 80s. By 1984, 85, were young men, they're teenagers, 15, 16, 17-year-old, and now they're public enemy number one, and there's all kinds of cocaine and guns in the neighborhood. Like, where did that come from? You know, CIA had a big hand in funding that because it was funding all this dark money, kind of dark policy, you know, this covert American foreign policy. That's something you have to worry about. And that's something that dovetails with all this stuff right now. And I don't want to get on too much of a tangent, but back to Barr and executing all these prisoners, Barr himself smugly said the only reason we didn't kill more prisoners was because we ran out of time, meaning Biden took office and they had to stop doing it. That's disgusting. And if you read up on all these cases, some of these people should clearly not have been put to death. You know, like, not to say that they didn't do horrible things, but I mean, the circumstances, you know, will make your heart break. And everybody was like telling Trump to pardon some of these guys, and he wouldn't do it. And a woman, he wouldn't do it. He doesn't care, you know, and that's who we had running our government. People who didn't care about other human beings, who didn't value life. And that should be the first, like, prerequisite of any leader. That's why I like Biden, because he's an empathetic guy. You know, I don't feel like he's BSing me. I feel like he does care. You know, he's like your grandfather or something. And he's smart enough to hire really smart young people around him. You know, I did Sandra Bernhardt's show last week. Sandra Bernhardt is one of my faves, a legendary comedian. And we got talking about Biden. She loves Biden, you know, and she was asking me, what do you think's going to happen in the election? Like, you think everybody's going to say he's too old and stuff? And I'm like, probably, you know, and it's a shame because it's a waste of time, because I feel like he is the man of the moment. And I tried to make the analogy, like, you know, you wouldn't go to Lincoln Center and be like, oh man, Leonard Bernstein's conducting tonight. He's like 85. Who wants to hear him? He's too old. You would never say that, right? There's some things you get better at as you age. Like the experience makes you more enriched, you know, as a conduit of this information. And I think of the presidency as a conductor, right? He's not there playing the parts. He's there conducting, and the different agencies, right? His cabinet make up these different sections. Like in a symphony, you got a string section and a horn section, a brass section, you know, you got timpani drums, you know, you got flutes, woodwinds, you got all this stuff, and you got a script, right? You got sheet music, you got a score, and you need a guy who's going to set the tempo and tell you who needs to play when, who needs to emphasize, you know, their thing, who needs to step out and do a solo, when we all need to play together, when we need to hang back, when we need to reach a crescendo. You know, that's what a conductor does. And that's what you want in a president, right? That's what you want in leadership. Somebody who knows how to bring the best out of those around them and let them work in concert, in harmony, right? That's what in concert means. Right? Working alongside others, you know, to achieve a result. And if it's done right, it makes beautiful music. And nobody says, hey, you know, if that guy is only 40 years old, that really would have been awesome. Like, you're not thinking about that. You know, you just want to be moved, right? And as a citizen, you want to be protected and you want to move our country forward. And you've never had a more difficult score, if you want to keep going with this metaphor, than what we have now, right? Because we have crumbling infrastructure, we have environmental catastrophe bearing down on us, right? And since the last time I've done this show, California's continued to have situations. New Zealand is flooding. You know, I saw people like swimming in the grocery store in New Zealand. You know, it's freezing. It's going to be supposed to be -8 here in New York on Saturday. It's not supposed to be -8 degrees in the Hudson Valley. I'm going to Broadway to see a play. Like, I don't even want to go out now, you know, and I love going to the theater, but I'm like, God damn, it's going to be 5 degrees, you know, like, that's not normal. None of this stuff is normal. Point being, you need somebody who's really good at conveying a message to make a difference, to not have us all just freak out and run in different directions and not deal with it. You want somebody who's like, here, judicial reform, right? Look at the problem we have in policing, as I talked about at the top of the show. This is all difficult stuff. And in my mind, age is a benefit. right? Because this guy's been through it, man. The day after, right, he was sworn in, his wife and his daughter were killed in a car accident. He's a single father and newly sworn in senator who has to, commute from Delaware on a train every day to Congress to raise his family, and then goes on to serve for 50 years. That was 1973, 50 years. And he's still doing it. And he got to, he got to be the vice president with Barack Obama, President Obama, who in my lifetime is my favorite, But I think Biden is going to go down like an FDR type guy if we stay on this course, Not saying everything is perfect. I'm not psyched about Merrick Garland. My instinct in the beginning was that was the one cabinet choice he was going to regret, because that guy is not reading the room. And I don't care what you say. And I'm still under the belief they're going to indict Donald Trump and they're going to move forward and all this. But you need to appease people, okay? We need some sort of sense that the scales of justice are coming into balance. And we're not getting that, right? Trump's on the campaign trail again. He was in New Hampshire last weekend taking selfies, in a McDonald's, pardon me, with his fans and shit. Like, how is this happening? How is this guy not in jail? But he's not. And I think that's going to be a failing. Not that you could just go in there and lock him up, but you got to at least look like you're moving in that direction. And finally, appointing a special counsel, a special prosecutor, 2 years into the thing, that's not to my liking. I feel like Sally Yates, wasn't that her name? Or was that Sally Yates, right? Or is that, I don't know if that's, I don't know if I'm mixing up Sally Ride, the astronaut. I think it was Sally Yates, right? Like that, I think she would have kicked ass. I feel like she would have given us what we want. And that's not saying you got to drag the guy out in shackles, but you have to make us feel like something has changed. And that stuff I just said about Bill Barr is clear. Like the DOJ was imminently corrupt. God, I almost had that guy's name, the report. I'm going to remember it as soon as I end this podcast, and it's going to drive me nuts. And some of you guys are probably saying it out loud as you listen to this. But anyway, so, we're getting a lot of indications that the FBI was corrupt. That's not indication, right? They indicted an FBI agent for being a spy for Deripaska, which is essentially Putin. That's Putin's biggest oligarch. And that's the guy who funded Paul Manafort. And that's what Paul Manafort was doing, working for free for Donald Trump and his campaign. Manafort did it without a salary because he owed tens of millions of dollars, or at least $10 million to Deripaska. And that was how he was paying him back, by delivering him a president of the United States. And this story goes way back. Like, I don't want to confuse people. I'm still trying to remember this guy's name. It's going to drive me absolutely bonkers. Durham report. Anyway, that was going to drive me nuts. I don't want to confuse people, because this stuff is like Byzantine at this point. If I could break it down in a nutshell, the Barr represents a time. Maybe I should do this next week, but the Iran Contra stuff was a time where a lot of money started to move around globally, right? The Soviet Union was collapsing, corruption and kleptocracy was taking hold, right? Meaning the oligarchs and the guys who controlled things like Rusal, which is Oleg Deripaska owns a big aluminum company, right? So there's a ton of money in minerals, aluminum, oil, gas, these natural resources that Russia has. That's where the wealth is in Russia. They don't make anything. Their GDP is the size of Italy or something, and they're not making Ferraris and beautiful clothes and all the great stuff they make in Italy. Not to diss Russia, but Russia's massive. If you look at it on a map, they don't really make much. They make vacuum tubes for guitar amps, and oil. Right? Crude, cheap oil. And that's where the Koch brothers come in, as I've talked about. They helped crack their crude. Cracking is the term you use for breaking down really crappy crude oil. It needs extra refinement, right? And that's what the Koch brothers' dad did under Stalin. He set up all these refineries in Russia. So their wealth comes from natural resources, which is exploiting the environment, right? And those companies are controlled by, oligarchs, right? And those guys had all the money. And when the Soviet Union started collapsing, there's a lot of cash on hand that you need to get out of the country. That cash started to come to the US. And a lot of people felt okay looking the other way because cash is still cash, and it's still getting pumped into the economy and spent, and that benefits a lot of people, which is why Donald Trump got a pass in the 80s, because he was selling these condos, right? Trump Tower, places he built in Florida, places he built all over New York City. They're selling them in LLCs, right? Meaning you don't know who's buying it. It's just a company name for all cash deals to Russian oligarchs. And everybody's kind of looking the other way, but a lot of money's coming in, and a lot of money's coming in South Florida. And cocaine is getting trafficked at the same time. Like Trump's helicopter pilot, Joseph Weisselbaum, who got busted for flying kilos of cocaine to Kentucky, North Carolina, and Ohio. And he got busted in Ohio, and he was in business with Trump. They had a helicopter company that flew high rollers to Atlantic City, right? So they're business partners. And the front in Miami was an auto dealership, right? And they would cocaine would come in to South Florida. They'd unpack it, unload it at this auto dealership in Miami, and then they load it up on planes and helicopters, and Trump's pilot would fly it up, right, to the mid-Atlantic states. And then he gets busted in Ohio. And you get busted in the 80s with a couple keys in your helicopter, like you're in trouble, right? War on drugs kind of thing. And it gets moved. It gets moved to his sister's district in North Jersey, right? Trump's sister, Mary Ann Barry, right? So she recused herself because her husband had actually been on the same pilot, on the same helicopter with this guy, and she knew him. So she recused him, got a Trump-friendly judge in her place that she appointed. He read a letter in court that, was written by Donald Trump, and it said what an upstanding guy, this Joseph Joey was, they called him. And he gets a slap on the wrist, essentially. And while he's standing trial, he gets an apartment for him and his brother in Trump Tower, right? And then when he gets out of his slap on the wrist, which was like 13 months at Danbury, he gets another. Trump Plaza was where the apartment with his brother. Then he gets his own condo in Trump Tower that he pays all cash for when he gets out of prison. Where does he get this cash, right? There's obviously a lot of money in cocaine dealing, and it's floating around. And the government, or the powers that be, decided certain people could move these commodities around, right? It's bad if it's inner city black guys packaging it up and cooking it and selling it on the streets. Then it's the evil to the extent we have to militarize our police departments and lock everybody up. But when it's white collar, when it's Donald Trump selling it out of Trump Tower to investment bankers, as he was doing forever, it was an open secret. You could go to the poker rooms and the poker dens in Trump Tower and buy cocaine. You could buy cocaine, at his casinos, right? Everybody's doing cocaine in the 80s and 90s. They still are, right? People are always going to do drugs. The war on drugs is stupid anyway. That's not to say to do drugs. It just, people are going to do drugs. You might as well make it safe for them, right? But anyway, you see my point? There's certain people that are allowed to work with above the law, right? For the greater good in the minds of these people. And Bill Barr was somebody who was always down on that plan. Most people never really picked apart the Iran-Contra scandal and what was going down with all that, and the CIA selling drugs. But Barr knew about all that, Barr, former CIA guy, AG, under H.W. Bush, who was partners with Manuel, Noriega, H.W. Bush was when he was at CIA. So that's his drug dealing buddy, who it was okay when we were getting the money to send the coke through Panama, which is a way station as well for a lot of drug trafficking out of South America. They bring it up to Central America to Panama, which we essentially controlled because of the canal. And then he didn't play right anymore. And then they arrested him, right? Noriega and brought him to Miami, right? You should watch the Panama Deception, Barbara Trent movie sometime. So this stuff is complicated, and I'm sure I've lost all of you guys already. But my point, think of it as like there's another economy. There's a gray economy that moves around the world, that moves money. And it has to do with money laundering and drug trafficking and human trafficking now. And that's things like, Robert Maxwell, who was Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, who Jeffrey Epstein was very intimately involved with, with financially, laundering money. Nobody ever really knows where Epstein got his money from, right? Maxwell was also an arms dealer. You had Adnan Khashoggi. Trump bought Khashoggi's yacht in the 80s. So all of these characters, all of these same players, they pop up in all of these scandals. And Barr's the fixer. He's the common denominator in a lot of this. And he knows the big picture, and he knows where the loose ends are. And Trump is somebody who was able to operate in that world essentially with impunity until it got too big, until he got into the Deripaska world, until Putin decided he wanted him to be president, and Mark Burnett had rehabbed his image to the American people. And now we have what we have, right? A sort of a rogue former president, who in the last 24 hours has said some batshit crazy stuff, attacking our intelligence agencies, attacking FBI on his Truth Social stuff, like stuff that you would never believe an ex-president or a president would say. Trump saying, because he's out of his mind. And the scary thing about Trump is if you had a guy who was more self-disciplined, like a Ron DeSantis is, who is also sort of familiar with the dark arts, right? DeSantis was at Guantanamo torturing people. He was, as a Navy JAG, he was in the Fallujah surge, telling special forces, Navy SEALs, like what was within the Geneva Convention in terms of interrogating enemy combatants, as they call them, going into villages and, torturing people essentially, right? So here's a guy who's willing to do all kinds of stuff for the country, and he's probably going to keep secrets better than Trump. Not that Trump hasn't kept the secrets, but Trump's a loose cannon, and he's out of his mind, and I'm surprised he's still alive, knowing how these guys operate. So, I don't want to get too into it now. I've been talking your ear off for a while, but you can see how all that stuff is connected. And if you can't see, I'll try to do a better job of explaining it. And there's some of it we frankly don't know, but that the same people keep popping up. And if you can keep that in mind, that there's another sort of economy that happens, and people who are involved in that world get a pass often, just like the mafia is allowed to operate to a certain extent, right? Everyone knows there's certain industries they got their hands in. Nobody goes and bugs them for trash collection, stuff in Jersey, right? You give it to them kind of thing, right? Because it goes to the greater good in certain people's minds. That's how you begin to understand some of this stuff, and it's difficult. But that New York Times Barr story last week Durham Barr story was nuts. It was bonkers, and I'm sure you saw a lot of people react accordingly. And then it kind of just fell out of the news cycle. And that's what I'm talking about with this, like we're overloaded at this point. Rachel Maddow did a great program the other night on how Barr tried to get the Stormy Daniels stuff shut down, which is now open again, thankfully, in New York, but he was trying to get him to even reverse the Michael Cohen judgment and stuff. He was trying to get his boy off for campaign finance reform. As an AG, as Attorney General, he was doing that, and the Epstein case, he said he was going to recuse himself from, because Epstein was his client when Barr was in private practice after his first stint as AG, right? He was his client when he came back as AG after auditioning for the role to be Trump's AG. And somebody asked him, right, because I think he was a little blindsided by the Epstein arrest. Somebody asked him, you're obviously going to recuse yourself, right? And he goes, yeah, of course I am. And then he reversed that decision the next day and said, no, actually, all the information about his case has to come to me first. Barr oversaw that case. Epstein shows up dead. Barr had visited New York apparently a few days before. I'm not saying Barr went into the cell and hung himself, but very suspicious death. And Barr didn't bother to raid Epstein's island until after Epstein was dead, or the house, on 71st Street, which I have friends of mine have been assaulted by Trump and Epstein in that place. So there's a lot of shady stuff and a lot of secrets that people don't ever want you to hear, and Trump is in the middle of all that. And the guys on the outside of it are more than happy to enable it. And in many ways they've won, right? Because the bad guys are not in charge, because we have Biden, but you have Kevin McCarthy and all these freaks in Congress now that, have no compunction, about doing bad stuff and no desire to figure out the truth, right? It's all like whatever Trump wants or whatever, their benefactors want is what's going to happen. And a lot of that is going to be chaos designed to wear you out. But I know it's not going to wear you out, right? Because we have each other, we have love, we have peace, we have harmony, we have music and art. And my suggestion is that we drink of that cup, right? Drink up, take as much in that makes you stronger, that makes you feel better, because we're going to need all hands on deck, for what's coming. Because in another couple of years, we got another election. So anyway, I will shut up now. I hope the audio was okay. I hope you like the lights. I got some fancy lights and I got a nice comfy chair to sit in. So I'm styling. Hope you guys are too. Thanks for listening. I love you as always. Episode 63 of the Noel Casler podcast. I'll play some more music next time, but thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Peace.